Okay, welcome back. We're going to move now into the female reproductive system. So we're going to start in the same place, which is going to be kind of a mid-sagittal view. We're going to do a lot of comparing back to the male as we go through the female. So right away we can see that we have less external structure and more internal structure. Again, these two things are kind of designed to fit together like a puzzle piece. So if we take the same pathway that we did in the male, we would start in the primary sex organ, which would be the ovary. This is where we're going to release the ova from the eggs, and then we're going to move into the uterine tube, which then leads into the uterus. The opening of the uterus is the cervix. That leads into the vagina, which then leads out into the vulva component, which consists of the mons pubis, the labia majora, the labia minora, the clitoris, and a couple gland structures that we will be looking at a little bit later. So definitely more going on internally here. So we have a much more complex role in the female. If we kind of think about the male, we say that, okay, the job of the male's reproductive system is to get the gamete to the female. Everything about the system is designed to make sure that the male gametes can get into the female's body and then be able to move through the system, eventually reaching the egg. The female's system is not designed to have really anything be motile. The egg is very big, very lumbering in its movement, and that's why the sperm have to go to it. The complexity then comes with the preparations for implantation and pregnancy and growing the embryo, the fetus, giving birth, and then on top of that, feeding and nourishing the infant. So there's a more extensive role for the females in terms of reproduction. Primary sex organs, again, are the ovaries. Just like the testes, they're dual endocrine exocrine, so they're going to release both our hormones and our ova. So we're going to start there with the ovaries. They sit on either side of the uterus, and they're much smaller than people think they are. So in a reproductively active female, so between menarche and menopause, the ovaries would be roughly the size of 2 almonds stacked on top of each other. So if you can picture that, that's basically what we're looking at when we think about ovaries. Generally, people tend to mentally compare them to testes, and they are fractions of a size of the testes. The ovaries are held in place by ligaments. And so, in fact, we're going to find out that the entire female reproductive system is held in place by ligaments. The ovaries are not attached to the uterine tubes, therefore it's really important that these ligaments hold them in place. So we have an ovarian ligament that runs from the ovary medial to the uterus. We have a suspensory ligament that comes down from the pelvic wall on the lateral sides and brings in the blood and nerve and lymphatic supply to the ovary. And then you have the suspension in what's called the mesovarium. That's one of the 3 parts of what's called the broad ligament that we're going to look at here in a second. So many, many ligaments holding this in place. We've got ovarian arteries, but then we also have ovarian branches of the uterine arteries that are going to perfuse them. If we think about the testes and think about how the development of the sperm occurred, it occurred from the outside in. So the sperm were developing as they moved in toward the lumen of the seminiferous tubules. The ovary is the opposite. The outer layer, the cortex, is where we find the follicles that contain the eggs. The inner portion is basically just where the blood and nerve supply come in. We don't have tubules. We don't have any sort of seminiferous tubules in the ovary. So what we do is we develop each egg in what's called a follicle. And the follicle is basically standing in for the tubule. It is a follicle that's going to be ovulated from the surface of the ovary during ovulation. Okay, so here we can see the ovarian ligament. Here's the suspensory ligament. So here we can see a better view of the suspensory ligament, and then this is the ovarian ligament. This broad piece of connective tissue here is called the broad ligament, and it has 3 different parts, and I think the best way to look at it is up here. The mesosalpinx is the portion that's attached to the tube. That's right here. Okay. The mesovarium, right here, is attached to the ovary, and then the mesometrium down here is attached to the uterus. So this piece of connective tissue essentially fills in the pelvic inlet in the female and is attached to pretty much all parts of the female's reproductive system. So we have a significant number of ligaments holding this in place. And they're important because, again, we don't have a direct connection between the uterine tube and the ovary. An egg is going to be ovulated from the surface, and then hopefully it moves into the tube. If it doesn't, then we have no ability for fertilization to take place. So these ligaments are really important to make sure that all of this lines up properly. So now we're going to move into the tubes. We're going to look at these portions here. So the job of the tube is to essentially kind of catch the ovulated egg or the oocyte wrapped up in its follicle. And so it starts with these fimbriae, these kind of like finger-like structures that are going to help kind of draw in the egg. And then we move into the infundibulum right here, and then the ampulla. The ampulla is the site of fertilization. So when we talk about how the sperm have a pretty significantly long journey to get to the egg, they have to be deposited in the vagina, get through the cervix, work their way up the uterus, and then all the way down the uterine tube. They have to get through this really narrow part called the isthmus, and they have to come all the way down the tube and fertilize the egg way down here. So this is where fertilization actually takes place. The mesosalpinx is again holding this in place. We have ciliated epithelium in here to help move the egg. The human egg cell, an oocyte, is one of the larger cells. You can see it with a fairly decent light microscope. It's that big of a cell, and so it's not going to be efficient in movement. It's the exact opposite of the male's gametes. The sperm are very specialized for motility. The egg is gigantic, and we'll see why that's the case a little bit later. Now, the uterus, we don't really have a counterpart for in the male, as it is the site of implantation and development of the embryo into the fetus. It is a muscular organ, kind of looks sort of like a pear sitting upside down. So this would be the bottom of your pear here, and this would be the top of your pear. It's going to consist of this fundus, this portion above the tubes, the body, and then the cervix, which is the opening. Now, the vagina is open to the outside world, and the uterus, via the uterine tubes, is open to the pelvic cavity, which means we're going to need to have some pretty significant protection at the opening of the uterus to make sure that anything from the outside environment doesn't have a clear passageway into the pelvic cavity of the female. So the cervix is going to be covered in a very thick cervical mucus. And that is actually going to inhibit sperm from entering through there unless we are in the window of fertilization within a given cycle. So there is protection there. That's just one of the many protections that we see. Again, the uterus is supported by ligaments. So we've got the mesometrium, we've got the cardinal ligament down here that kind of sits almost at the point where we meet up with the vagina. We've got a uterosacral that runs posterior from the uterus to the sacrum. We've got round ligaments. All of these are supporting this structure. All of these are going to stretch significantly during pregnancy. And if you think back to what ligaments are, we know that they can stretch, but they don't recoil. So there's no elastin in ligaments. It's all collagen. So collagen can stretch, but it can't recoil. And so it's like stretching out a rubber band, but stretching it to the point where it can no longer recoil back into its original shape. Pregnancy absolutely permanently alters the female's body, at least internally, because these ligaments that are holding everything in place will never come back to their original state because they just don't have elasticity in them. So if we look again at the uterus now internally, we've got the wall. So the perimetrium is kind of the outer connective tissue blending into the broad ligament. Then we've got the myometrium. This is the very thick layer of smooth muscle that's going to contract when the uterus contracts. And then we've got the endometrium, the innermost layer, which consists of two layers. The deepest of them is called the stratum basalis, and then the most superficial is the stratum functionalis. When you shed the endometrium through menstruation, you're only losing the stratum functionalis. You do not lose the stratum basalis. The job of the stratum basalis is to regenerate the stratum functionalis for the next cycle. So we never actually lose all of the endometrium. There is a huge blood supply here because if fertilization and implantation take place, we are going to have enough blood to support the growing fetus. So we've got uterine arteries that come off of the internal iliacs that then have this massive branching and eventually lead all the way out into the very most superficial portion of the stratum functionalis. The vagina is the copulatory organ, so this is the counterpart to the penis in the male. We tend to boil the male's reproductive system down to a penis. People tend to boil the entire female reproductive system down to a vagina. Just everything's called vagina. But if you go back to that first comic on the first page, you can definitely see that there's more parts to all of this. The vagina is basically a muscular tube. And like the uterus, it's a potential space, not an actual space. It really only opens if there's something in it. It has the ability to stretch. It has the ability to open up. But if there's nothing in it, then it tends to kind of wrinkle down using the rugae that are in there, and it is very tends to be very short, and the walls are touching each other. The anterior and posterior walls are touching each other. Same thing with the uterus. If there's nothing in it, a non-pregnant uterus, then the walls are touching each other. So these are potential spaces, not actual spaces. It's only a few centimeters long if nothing is in it. It does extend from the external body surface all the way to that cervix. So again, we have to make sure that we're being careful that whatever enters the vagina does not necessarily enter the cervix and then the uterus and then the tubes and then the pelvic cavity. Anatomically, it sits directly between the urethra and the rectum. So it's posterior to the urethra and anterior to the rectum. This means that, vaginal pain can also present as urethral pain or rectal pain. And, there is definitely some overlap in the sensation there. So this is the passageway for anything that's going to come in or out of the female reproductive system. Birthing, menstrual flow, penis, whatever. The mucosa tends to fold significantly, and that's how it sort of shrinks down when there's nothing in it. But it has a great capacity for stretching and growing. When we talk about the birth canal and whether or not a baby can fit through, we're absolutely not talking about the vagina. The vagina is essentially one size fits all. A baby can come out of it. It's designed to tear if it needs to, and then fairly easily heal back together. So the idea that the vagina itself is too small doesn't usually happen. The vagina does not have any actual glands in and of itself. The walls essentially will sort of seep serous fluid, and that's where vaginal lubrication comes in. And then this also decreases as the female ages, and so we tend to see vaginal dryness become an issue, particularly after menopause. So I mentioned the idea of the cervical mucus being protective. The pH of the vagina is also protective. It tends to be very acidic between menarche and menopause. So during the years of menstruation, which are the childbearing years, the pH switches to a more acidic environment to decrease growth of any microorganisms that are introduced into the vagina. The opening, the external vaginal orifice, may or may not be covered by a sort of flap of mucosa called the hymen. So not everybody has a hymen. Some people have a hymen that is so complete that it has to be surgically opened. A hymen is not an indication of virginity under any circumstances. Even if one is present or partially present, it can easily be broken by many things that have nothing to do with having any sort of sexual intercourse. So again, some people are born with one, some people are not. It has nothing to do with whether or not somebody's been sexually active. If you have a hymen, could having sex be something that would break that? Absolutely. And that's where we tend to see some bleeding issues that would come into play. But oftentimes, it's broken much earlier. One of the more common ways of doing it is when a little girl falls riding a bike and basically, hits that bar in the middle of the bike. That's a common way that happens. So now we're going to take a look at the external genitalia, which is termed the vulva. This entire sort of area is what we're talking about when we talk about the vulva. It consists of many parts. We start with the mons pubis, which is a fat pad that overlies the pubic symphysis. This tends to be more pronounced in females because we've got the loosening of that joint in pregnancy, and so we need a little more protection. The fatty tissue extends down then to form the labia majora. This is basically just extensions of this tissue. It's very similar to what we would see in the mons pubis. The labia minora are the inner folds of tissue, and they tend to be a much thinner skin. The skin is more similar to what we would find in the scrotum. Within the male, it tends to flush with blood during excitation and tends to be more active. The labia minora enclose a space called the vestibule, and that is where we're going to find the vaginal orifice and the external urethral orifice all enclosed, along with the openings of the gland structures that we're going to talk about down here. Now, the labia minora are going to fuse anteriorly to form the prepuce that is going to be the sort of the female foreskin that is covering the glans clitoris. The clitoris is essentially homologous to the penis. It has many of the same structures. It has a glans, it has the foreskin, it has a body, and then the crura, which we saw in the male, that attaches this entire structure to the pubic arch here. Now, the entire clitoris is made of corpus cavernosa tissue, so it's that same erectile tissue that we saw in the male. Now, the gland structures are the greater vestibular glands right here that feed into the vaginal opening here. These are homologous to the bulbourethral glands in the male. They provide lubrication for the orifice of the vagina to help facilitate the start of intercourse, and then the vaginal walls will, of course, begin to seep their fluid. We also have these structures here called the bulbs of the vestibule or vestibular bulbs, either way. These are actually corpus spongiosum tissue, and when the female becomes excited, they're going to engorge and fill with blood, and it's going to have an effect of essentially pushing inward onto the penis, and that's going to provide friction for the penis and make it more likely that ejaculation would occur. Because again, these two systems exist to make babies, so there are certainly some things that are occurring here that are going to make it more likely that that would happen. The breast tissue is going to function obviously in the nourishment of the infant. So we're talking about mammary glands. Males and females have these. They only function in females, but males have them. These are actually modified sweat glands. They're technically part of the integumentary system. But you could see that the gland structure is basically sort of radiating out from the nipple and is embedded in adipose tissue. The entire structure sits anterior to the pectoral muscles. So here would be your pec major and your intercostal muscles, and then all of this tissue sits on the outside of that. This is a nice view of what the actual secretory tissue looks like in a lactating breast. So it is fairly significant, and then there is this sort of connective tissue that winds through this. So the glands all are going to have ductwork that's going to end up opening onto the nipple. We'll talk about breastfeeding in our next chapter, but essentially these glands are going to produce breast milk, and then there will be a squeezing of the glands that would then push the milk out onto the nipple so that it can be consumed by the baby. The structure, again, is held in place by suspensory ligaments. So the breast tissue, like the rest of the female's reproductive system, is held in place by ligaments. The breast tissue will enlarge during pregnancy and then breastfeeding. And then again, those ligaments, they don't recoil. There's just not elasticity in them. So, this concept that pregnancy doesn't really, permanently alter the female's body is just wrong. There is absolutely permanent changes that occur.